It's been a long 2 weeks. Okay, so we're going to talk about the transparency in learning and teaching approach, or TILT, that was developed by Mary-Ann Winklemas. And first, I'd like you to download the slides, which you can do either by just holding your camera up to that QR code, and it will give you the option of adding it to your Google Drive, or to make a copy of it in your Google Drive. And then if we update this at some point in the future, which we'll probably be doing again, you'll have a more recent copy if you click on that in going forward. So did you get a copy?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So the basic motivation for this is that, students don't always know what we want for them to do. And sometimes their guesses are wrong. And we get these assignments which don't meet those expectations that we have of what students would be doing. And that's frustrating for us when we have to give them feedback and grade their work. And it's also pretty frustrating for students because they didn't know what to expect. And often students will use the first assignments in a class as kind of a guessing game where they're trying to make guesses about what you want. And some of them will guess correctly, some will guess incorrectly. And that's not really very good for anyone. But the more serious issue is which students are more likely to guess incorrectly, and which are more likely to guess correctly on what you expect. If you'd like to say something, or Maggie.
Yeah, I think that, we all know our students come in with varied levels of preparedness when it comes to college learning, and the types of schools that they have come from may not always be focused on college prep. And so our first generation students, students who are coming from those underprepared school districts are at a disadvantage when we don't make the expectations of the work that we want our students to complete in the class very clear. Because students who have had that experience, or who have family who is engaged in college level education in varying degrees, they have that insight, they have that support structure they can rely on. And, if we want to ensure that we have a more equitable experience for our students, we need to think about leveling the playing field and making sure that all of our students, no matter their backgrounds, are able to succeed in our class.
And, it's not necessarily the fault of the high schools. We have really
Yeah.
seriously segregated housing patterns. We have students who live in low income areas where the funding for schools is a little bit lower. That's been equalized to some extent by state and federal funds. But if you're teaching in a school district where only maybe 1% or less go on to college, you probably aren't going to devote as many resources to preparing students for college. If you're in a school district where 70 or 80% of your students go on to college, you're going to have better preparation for those students. And again, parents' education, parents' income affects what students know coming into the school district. So the students who tend to have the most problems in our classes, generally, we know that based on DFW rates and so forth, are the students who are, as Maggie just said, first generation students who are not generally well prepared. And the TILT approach is designed to address all of these things. And one other point there is that, if you're in a traditional type of class where you have 3 exams or 3 papers, or maybe 4 exams or papers, when students guess wrong that first time, that can really have a serious impact on their probability of being successful. And there's lots of ways of addressing it. But one interesting way is the TILT approach. And basically, if we could shift students' effort so they're not trying to guess what we need, but if they can focus, if they know exactly what we want them to do, they can focus more on learning and less about trying to figure out what we're expecting from them. And the TILT approach is designed to address all of that. And basically, it's designed to take the guesswork out of the learning process, optimize student learning so that they're using their time efficiently in the way we want them to work on the tasks we want them to do and the things we want them to learn. and also help students understand how and why they're doing things. We'll talk about each of these as we move through. But one of the most important benefits of this is that it can reduce those equity gaps based on first gen status, by income, and so forth. And there's really, one of the nice things about the tilt approach is that there's really only 3 things you do with an assignment that we often have done to some extent, but perhaps not as extensively as we'd like. One is to define the purpose of each assignment you give students, the tasks that they have to do, and the criteria. And we'll talk about each of those using the suggestions of Mary-Ann Winklemas. Maggie, do you want to talk about the purpose here?
So students need to know what the goal is of each learning task. And so one of the best ways you can approach this is making it very clear, very explicit, what you hope students will get out of each learning activity. And so maybe that's connecting it to the learning outcomes, and maybe it's having a conversation with them about why you are engaging in this task, and but making it very clear to your students on why.
And many of us do that by talking to students, but the problem is students may not remember what you say in class when they actually sit down to do the work. So the suggestion is, whether it's an online class or an in-person class, you always explicitly write down the purpose. And it's not just, the main reason, one of the main reasons here is that if students understand why they're doing things, they're going to be more motivated to do it, because students often see some of the work we ask them to do as being busy work. They don't see its connection to what they want to do later. So the goal is to make it much more explicit in terms of why we're doing the things we're doing. And again, this is also a good practice because sometimes we just do things because we've always done them, and thinking about why you're doing each task and how it connects to what you want students to learn can help you make sure that you do have a nice backwards design process, that everything you do is connected to the goals you want students to be able to achieve, and also making it clear to students that these are things that may be helpful in future classes or later in their life and somehow. And that's why it matters. It helps them see the relevance of the task and so forth. So the first thing is, you always state the purpose. This is why we're doing this. It's not just busy work. There's a meaning to it. And then the next thing is the task.
And so, by giving students, the step-by-step for each task, they can better, they don't have to, as we were saying before, they don't have to make guesses on how to complete a task. They know, that expectation is drawn out right for them. So, I know often in lab classes, this seems to be kind of an intuitive structure that you would embed in your labs and in your work, but to really think about extending this to all of your assignments, to giving them examples of high quality work, or a variety of work that meets the learning objectives, can really give students the confidence to move forward with the assignment, knowing that they can hit all of the criteria and that they know what that actually looks like.
And the reason for multiple exemplars is that if you only give students one sample of what high quality work looks like, they're all going to turn in things. Again, it varies by course. If you're doing lab reports, it may all tend to look the same because you want it to in some way. But in many cases, if you give students an example of a paper, for example, on a particular topic and a particular approach, they're all going to look remarkably similar. But if you can show students there's multiple ways of addressing that, they're more likely to be a little bit more creative, and you're not going to get all identical types of submissions coming in.
And my sort of funny story about that is when I taught research methods for the first time here in Oswego, I didn't have a whole lot of exemplars of high quality work because it was the very first time I had taught it. And typically when I teach a class, I will reach back out to students to ask them if I can use their anonymous work in future classes. And but this time I didn't have that. So I used a example of a paper that I had written in grad school, and which is maybe not the best option because, our graduate school work might be very different than the kind of work that our, students had. But I, attempted to give them, a shortened version of something I had written previously. And the title that I gave to my paper, however many years ago was something, colon, a research proposal. And all of the students titled their paper, not all of them, but many of them titled their paper in that same exact structure. Again, I think because they saw the example and they were like, okay, this is what I must, have to do. So anyways, point is, like John said, having lots of examples will kind of, give students a little bit of creativity and allow them to know they don't have to follow a specific formula to achieve the goals of the assignment, but that's, there's lots of ways to have high quality work.
And I actually have a similar story. I didn't put my own work. I teach an econometrics class, but one year I had 3 students who ended up having the papers published in economic journals, which is the most I've ever seen happen from that class. But I took copies of those and put them in examples of past students' work. And the goal was to inspire them, saying that, even as an undergraduate, you can do interesting work that could get published if you put, some extra effort into it. But instead, it really intimidated students in the class because they were not expecting to be writing at a level that could get published in a peer-reviewed journal. And also, 2 of the papers happened to be based on microfinance, but that was a big topic at the time. And one student had gotten data from the Grameen Bank, another person had gotten data from another research project. And so 2 of the 3 topics were again on a very narrow topic, and lots of students wanted to work on microcredit. And it was just a coincidence that those 2 students happened to work on that and get their work published. Although it was a time when there was a lot of work being published on microcredit at the time. But the main point is, if students haven't been exposed to that and they don't necessarily know how to do these things from their past educational experiences, they may not, those students are not going to be as prepared in terms of what you expect from them. And, it's much easier to get those expectations clear than to do multiple revisions, to give them feedback saying, this doesn't quite meet what you're expected to do. If we can make it clear to students early on, it makes it so much easier to evaluate and assess the work and give them somewhat higher level feedback on future iterations if it's an iterative process. So the last part of this approach is the criteria. And one way of doing that is to jointly develop, either share the rubric. If you're using a rubric, either create and share that right in the assignment itself, or at least provide a description of what's expected from them and how you're going to be grading it. What are you looking for when you assign the grade? And if it's co-developed with students, that gives them a little bit more buy-in, and they often better understand why you're asking for these things, because these are things they thought were important.
And I think it's important to, I know I often put rubrics on Brightspace and I always direct students to those rubrics, but I think, obviously sharing them in those spaces is really important so students have access to it at any point, but to really spend some time in class, at least talking about it, reminding students where to find it, maybe even going over that rubric, because if, I know for me that if I don't initiate space in the class to be specifically talking about the rubric, they just may not look at it, right? They might know it's there, but they just, they might just continue on without actually, using that rubric to compare the work that they've created to before they submit it. And so I've even created a little checklist prior to submission or on the submission link that says, did I, or I, have looked at the rubric and I've spent time looking at my work relative to, the rubric, and I make students sort of check that box that, yes, I've done this. So that way they're really forced to remember and, use that rubric, for their work.
And include in the rubric explanations of what's meant by each of the criteria for in the rubric. And again, it's for the same reason that if students don't quite understand what you're getting at, you're going to get work that will reflect the fact that they don't understand what's expected. And again, the students who need that the most are the students who haven't done that type of work in previous coursework. And here are some interesting redesigns, and I thought we'd just take a look at maybe a few of these. If we scroll down, this is from Mary-Ann Winklemas Tilt Higher Ed website. But here is a, here we go, example assignments where they're more or less transparent. Let's pick one. Well, how about Science 101? So I haven't looked at this one actually recently, but this is the original assignment. These are all things that were submitted by people who were in workshops with Mary-Ann Winklemas. And this was the original assignment where people read through a poster and answered some questions. Originally they were asked for the title of their poster, what's the ethical question being asked, which presumably was part of the assignment. The posters address that. What pieces of evidence do they provide in opposition and in support? Are there pieces of evidence from peer-reviewed sources? How are the pieces of evidence presented? And this doesn't really look all that different than many assignments that many of us would give. But what's missing in terms of the tilt approach? Remember, there were three criteria: the purpose, the task, and the criteria.
Well, the purpose, I think, is a big missing thing.
Yeah. And I have to say, most of the assignments I've given over the years did not include a purpose. And when I'm teaching in class, I will talk about why we're doing things. And online, I may have a video introducing a class explaining why various things are done, but students won't necessarily remember that when they actually sit down to do specific assignments, because they're generally taking 5 courses and each class has different expectations. And it's really easy for them to not remember things that they saw at the beginning of the term. So here is a revised one. So it begins with a purpose, and it tells students explicitly, your goal here is to analyze a scientific poster, increasing your familiarity with how they're constructed and help you later in the class when you create your own poster designs, your own effective poster designs. And these are the things that they'll be looking for in this assignment. And then the task is very similar to what was there before, basically, except you notice there's a little bit more detail, identifying whether it's from a popular source, scientific peer-reviewed, non-scientific peer-reviewed, and so forth. And not just what types of evidence are presented. There's that EG there listing the different types. And the criteria is pretty simple. It's reflecting how completely you answer the questions. Other assignments, like if people are working on a discussion board, might be a bit different, but or if they're working on a paper, you're going to have more elaborate discussions. But the criteria could just be if you've answered all these questions correctly, for example. And let's jump back and take a look at one more.
I'm going to interrupt for a second. Another thing
Sure.
I noticed on the example, and it's a really small thing, but it's the spacing between 1 and 2. 1 would potentially invite some students that I've had to try to answer in bullets and respond using that document, whereas there's no way in the second one for anyone to even approach that. So even though there's no guidance in either one that it needs to be like complete sentences and not bullets.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're more likely to fill it out in another document or just spread things out a little bit. But in the other case, it's much more likely they'd just be short, brief responses, even though much more is being, well, actually they did have that, some of the details there, but just spreading it out a bit more on that second version. Well, the spacing does make it clearer that more is expected. And these additional things, I think, help too.
Yeah.
That's just one example. Let's look maybe at one more to see that. Any preference? Well, how about psychology? Here, there's instructions on this. There's a topic, and then so forth. So again, it's missing that initial purpose, and it's also missing. Yeah.
There's like a few criteria thrown in there,
but they're spread out throughout it.
yeah.
It does say a 3 to 4 page paper, so there's a bit, the tasks are generally defined. I'm not sure how important the 12-point Times New Roman font is, but again, some people strongly prefer that. But now here it's talking about the goals of the course is to introduce students. And so there's a little bit of discussion there in terms of the purpose, but if you break that out, it's a little bit clearer to students. It's not mixed in with the rest of the instructions. And just saying you'll do this at the beginning of the term and the end, but it's not really clear why you're going to do this twice, I think. And so if we go down here, there's a purpose. And you notice it explains right at the beginning. It helps you understand how your beliefs change throughout the semester. It notes that you're going to be working on a metacognitive activity, and that how this can, well, it doesn't say this, but it would also be nice to say that that can improve your ability to remember things. There's a fair amount of evidence that metacognitive reflection can help students learn things longer term and increase transferability. And so again, there's much more, well, there's more detail on the how to answer it. And it's also saying you should rate how confident. Some of that was in the other, but here, again, the criteria is explicitly stated, and it doesn't have to be long. But if you can get into the habit of doing this, and I haven't yet, this is something I do want to do more of. One of the things, some related research is the work done by Vijay Sathi and Kelly Hogan and many other people who've looked at the impact of structure on student learning. And structure basically is this type of thing, but it's generally not necessarily as structured as this approach. And the whole notion of structure is you just provide students with all the things that Mary-Ann Winklemas described. She's just putting it in one particular way of organizing it. And there's a tremendous amount of research that adding more structure, more detail, more explanations about what's expected, and more details on the steps and adding more steps to the process, rather than asking people to write a 20-page paper that's going to be due next month, scaffolding that work and adding more steps along the way so that students don't procrastinate and so forth. This ties in really nicely to this. It's one particular approach, but I think both approaches work by making sure that students know more about what's expected from them. Okay, now hopping back to the slides here. There's been a lot of study, a lot of it done by Mary-Ann Winklemas and people who work with have worked with her in various experiments. And what they found is that if you introduce, and this has been done institution-wide at a number of institutions, and she's trying to get more and more institutions to buy into this. Originally, she worked at several teaching centers, but now she works full-time on Tilt, giving workshops on campuses, and working on the website and working on research. But what's been found is that when the Tilt approach has been introduced in even just one assignment in a gateway course, which is really small impact in terms of the amount of transformation, it increases student course grades, student achievement, it increases student persistence in the program. They looked at the effect of having the Tilt approach applied in one gateway course. Again, even in just one assignment in that class leads to a higher retention rate of students who were in this class compared to classes that did not engage in this. And some of that's been done by pre-post comparisons. Some of it's been done by introducing it in some classes and not others. So there's at least a number of different studies that have been found, and the results are persistent up to 3 years. Now, it may last longer than that, but it's only been studied through 3 years. And it tends to increase student motivation. Students are more likely to submit assignments and so forth when you remove some of the uncertainty from it. And it improves students' ability for self-regulation, because once they've done 1 or 2 assignments where they know what's expected, they're likely to pursue that. Even if you don't do this in later assignments, they have a better idea of what they should be doing and why they should be doing it. And the important thing here, again, I think one of the most important reasons to consider the tilt approach, or at least introducing more structure in some way, is that students come into school, and Maggie was talking about this just a little while ago. Students come into our classes with very different prior experiences. And some students go to college, perhaps some go to private high schools and so forth. We had a podcast interview with John Friedman yesterday, who actually who worked on a President's Advisory Council. He's a faculty member. He's the chair of the department at Brown, and he's a National Bureau of Economic Research fellow. And he did a study with Raj Chetty and another really well-known economist whose name is escaping me at the moment. But what they found basically in their study was that the most elite private institutions tend to favor students who are from higher income families, but specifically, students are more likely to be accepted into the Ivy Plus institutions if they come from a private school. And even though they have the same SAT scores, they're about twice as likely, if I remember correctly, to be admitted into the elite colleges, because they know those students tend to be more successful, because those institutions devote many more resources to preparing students for college. And they advertise the fact that if you go to their schools, you're much more likely to be accepted to college than if you go to a public high school in general. And there's a fair amount of research on that. But the main point is, many of our students are not coming from those elite private schools. Most of them are coming from public schools, and a growing number of them are coming from under-resourced schools, or where the families in those school districts do not have as many resources to assist students. And basically, if you come from a family where everyone's gone to college, where siblings go to college, where your friends are going to college, and you have older friends who've been in college, they give you some advice and tell you what's expected. If you're the first person in your family to go to college, and very few people from your school district are going to college, you often don't know as much about what to expect. And the tilt approach is designed to make clear, make explicit those expectations in general. And, one other thing, I don't think this has been studied, but, one thing I've been wondering is if maybe the tilt approach, by shifting students' focus to learning and giving them more information, and if students better understand why they're doing things, they might be less likely to rely on AI tools, for example, to complete assignments outside of class. And Maggie, earlier, by the way, in terms of AI, many of us have very mixed feelings about it. It can be a very useful tool for us, but we don't want students to use it to escape learning. But one way in which we could use it is, Maggie suggested, creating some sample work for students. One of our colleagues, Stephanie Pritchard, does a lot of work in writing. And one of the things she does is she has ChatGPT generate exemplars of students' work. So she'll have them generate a variety of topics and a variety of examples, and then edit it to make it a little bit clearer, to remove any of the problems that the AI tool may have built into it. But, that's one way of providing examples if you don't have past student work that you can ask students, to share in the future.
And I've also liked using AI myself to make sure that my instructions for assignments are clear. There's sometimes, I might use language that, is not the most explicit or direct, way to communicate something. And so I like even using it myself to make sure that I'm, very clear and concise with my instructions.
Because things that are obvious to us may not be obvious to the student reading it, because we come in with a lot more knowledge about the discipline and what we expect. And again, we were very successful in our schools so that we didn't have these types of issues where we didn't understand what was expected, or at least we learned that pretty quickly somewhere along the way, or we wouldn't have gotten to this point. But our students aren't always there, and we lose so many students from the students who enter through graduation. It would be nice if we could cut those losses a little bit to allow more students to be successful. And at the very end, and this was one of the reasons for sharing the slides, is there's a Tilt higher ed site. There's that assignment checklist, which you could use as a template if you want. It just has, and you can delete all the rest, but basically you put in the assignment name, the due date, the purpose, the task, and the criteria. And she's just describing that. But it's not a bad starting point. And we also, Rebecca Mastera and I did an interview with her in May of this year too, if you want to hear her talking about the approach. So there's a link to that too. So that's all I've got. Any thoughts or questions or?
Well, I'm just thinking it's really good to be able to put a term to this. That I find that helpful because in my background, one of the things I did was help develop some courses for Coursera on digital manufacturing. And a lot of these principles were there because there's a lot of non-traditional learners that are taking those courses, but there was no overarching framework to attach them to and to share them. So that's my initial reaction.
And it's especially important in asynchronous courses because, again, they don't have you in front of them to ask questions of, But again, even in face-to-face classes, it does help to make these things explicit. Well, yeah, that's all I've got. Go ahead.
It's all been helpful. Thank you. Thank you both.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. And thanks for joining us. I'm going to stop the share. It's something I want to do more of myself, and it's a plan for this semester. I just haven't gotten around. I've been adding more and more structure to my assignments, providing more examples and more detail, and breaking more complex tasks up into smaller and smaller chunks, just so that it doesn't seem as unmanageable, and so it can reduce the procrastination issues. But this is, for many assignments, I think this could be helpful.
Yeah, and like you said, line it and.
Yeah, I struggle with the whole pedagogy, andragogy, all that sort of spectrum. But I think of with some of the social behavioral research stuff, there's the concept of respect for autonomy. And so much with college students, and a lot of the past has been not respecting their autonomy and their desire to be there. And it's like, no, they start to have a say, and they may vote with their feet or they may not explicitly say it, but you have to respect that. Now, I think there's a number of faculty who might focus more on, what was one of my notes, the ability to differentiate between students and their performance. And so making from a more of a faculty perspective, their life easier, as opposed to the perspective of all students should be able to achieve an A or learn the material, which makes breaking out students much more difficult potentially if you're thinking in terms of a bell curve.
Right.
But maybe that's not the way that you should be framing this whole thing. And I think the tilt gets to a lot of that, or at least starts those discussions and conversations.
Yeah. Bell curves can be troubling for students when they know that if they all do better, it's not going to help.
Yeah.
So having some predetermined criteria for success is probably gives them a little bit more sense of autonomy, that they have more control over it. The grades are not just determined by how everyone else does, it's determined by whether they meet these criteria. And, you know, that's a better environment to be in, unless you happen to know that you're always going to be at the top of that distribution. So
Which you'll still be at the top of that distribution even if there is no bell curve.
that's true. Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyways,
Okay. Well,
Thanks so much.
thank you.
have a good one.
Yep, you too. Stop the recording. I meant to do that.